Hey, welcome back to Enchanted Kitchen. Hope you're all doing well. Happy New Year and happy 2022. I hope you had a great holiday season, spending quality time with friends, family, and loved ones. I can't believe we're already in the new year, but what better way to celebrate and kick it off with a nice sweet dessert. And today we're making this matcha roll cake, which is actually like a sponge cake, nice and light and airy, and filled with a rich, sweet, and creamy red bean whipped cream. So to get started, I'm taking my dried red azuki beans and placing them into a medium-sized saucepan. And to be honest with you, I forgot to pre-soak them the night before, so I would recommend that you soak them in cold water overnight and then just drain them of that water. That way they don't take as long to cook. For me, I added the water along with some granulated white sugar or cane sugar, whatever sugar that you have on hand would work. And it did take quite a while for it to boil and soften and break down, so I do recommend the pre-soaking the night before. But essentially, you're just cooking the beans until they're nice and soft where you can mash them with a fork. And you can see there as I'm stirring it with my fork, I like a consistency that's not quite pureed or blended completely. I like to have a little bit of texture from the red bean itself. I think it just adds some interest in your whipped cream, but of course you could always just use a stick blender or any sort of blender device to blend up those beans. And then once that red bean paste is cooled down, you want to add it into your sweetened whipped cream. So I just had some heavy whipping cream that was whipped up before for my white Christmas cake, which I'll link down below if you're interested. And so I just already sweetened that whipped cream with some powdered sugar and a little bit of vanilla extract, and then just folding in that red bean paste. And then once your whipped cream is done, you want to go ahead and set that aside and move on to the cake. So for the sponge cake, it's very simple and straightforward. You want to take a large bowl that I already pre-measured some all-purpose flour into, and then to the flour I'm adding some cornstarch, and the cornstarch will help your cake be more malleable, more flexible, and less likely to crack when you roll it later. And in addition to the cornstarch, I'm just adding about a teaspoon of baking powder, of course, just to give a little bit of lift and just add to the light and airy texture of our sponge cake. And of course, like any dessert, you gotta add a little bit of salt to help enhance those flavors. And I almost forgot, oddly enough, because this is a matcha green tea sponge cake or roll cake, I almost forgot the matcha green tea powder, but go ahead and just add, about 1 tablespoon. I'm actually using a teaspoon measure here because I wasn't quite sure if I wanted 2 teaspoons versus 1 tablespoon, which is 3 teaspoons. But originally, when I first made this recipe, I used 2 tablespoons of matcha powder, which certainly tasted really good, and it added to that bitterness that green tea adds, and of course it really helped to enhance the color, but for me it was a little bit too dark, so I opted for just 1 tablespoon of green tea matcha powder for this size cake. And then just whisk that together until it's all homogenized. Of course, I'm using a bowl that's slightly too small, always running the risk there, but anyway, go ahead and move on to the eggs. So go ahead and crack in 4 large eggs into a large bowl. And then to the 4 large eggs, add some granulated white sugar, and then taking either a stand mixer fitted with the whisk head attachment or handheld electric mixer like what I'm using, you want to whip it on high speed until it triples in volume and looks a light pale yellow in color. And you'll also know as you're beating, it'll leave those beater tracks within that egg and sugar mixture. That way you know there's enough volume and it's nice and light and airy. And then at that point, you want to go ahead and stop the mixer and switch over to a sifter along with your dry ingredients, and then just sift your dry ingredients in about 1/3, with each sift or with each fold. I do like to kind of fold it in batches as opposed to just dumping it all in. That way it takes less time to fold in and you're less likely to deflate that egg and sugar mixture. And then once it's all folded in, you want to go ahead and pour it into your prepared jelly roll cake pan. So this one's about 9 by 13 inches. I forget how tall it is, but just like an inch or so, maybe a couple inches tall. And you just make sure that it's greased really liberally with some butter or oil, and of course line it with some parchment paper if you have it, just to ensure that it'll come out cleanly. And also, I forgot to mention that your oven should be preheated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit or 180 degrees Celsius. Just make sure it's really preheated, and you have an oven thermometer just to make sure that's the right temperature. And then once your batter is all smoothed out in the pan, and I do like to kind of give it a few taps on the counter just to make sure you're releasing any of those air bubbles or air pockets, and then just bake it off for a few minutes. I would say between 8 to 10 minutes until a skewer inserted in the center comes out cleanly, or mostly clean is fine. And it should also kind of be light and springy to the touch as well. And now at this point, I let my cake cool for, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes or so. I didn't really time it, but basically it should be mostly cool and just ever so slightly warm before you roll your cake. You do need to be a little bit warm, that way it's a little bit more malleable and flexible and it's less likely to crack. And I do like to give it a generous sifting, a generous dusting or snowing of powdered sugar. That way it just helps to prevent the cake from sticking to your parchment paper, or you can also use a tea towel for this. A lot of people use tea towels to help roll their jelly roll cakes. And also, of course, make sure that it's released from the pan by just running a knife around the perimeter. And then, like I said, I'm using parchment here, parchment paper, just because that's convenient for me. But of course you could use a tea towel of some sort, basically as long as it can hold the cake. And you want to go ahead and just take one fell swoop and just have a leap of faith and just go ahead and flip it over. And then once the cake is flipped over, go ahead and remove the pan. Hopefully it comes out cleanly with the help of that parchment paper that we put down below before we baked our cake. And then we want to remove that old piece of parchment paper because it's no longer needed. And after you remove it, you want to generously dust this surface with, again, another hefty dose of powdered sugar, just to make sure, again, that doesn't stick to your parchment paper as you're rolling the cake. And then once it's generously dusted with powdered sugar, you're ready to roll. And with the addition of the cornstarch, it really shouldn't be prone to cracking. However, it does need to be the right temperature, slightly on the warm side, but to be honest with you, mine was slightly too warm, and you'll see later what happened. But I prefer to roll it on the shorter end, but of course you can roll it from the longer end. It's completely your choice, depending if you want a shorter or longer cake. And then once your cake is all rolled up in the parchment paper or tea towel, you want to let it rest and finish cooling, and that way it can really hold its shape and really hold the memory of this roll. And you'll see there as I'm unrolling the cake, as I'm unraveling it, it really hasn't cracked at all, so it worked out really nicely. And then at this point, again, the cake should be completely cool before you fill the cake, just like any other cake. That way it doesn't melt the whipped cream, but go ahead and just spread over your red bean whipped cream, which is so delicious, so creamy and rich. I love it. And it should be at this point super easy to roll the cake back up the same way you rolled it the first time, because it has that memory to the shape and the form of that roll. And you can see here as I'm rolling it, I was getting a little nervous because I noticed that the cake kept sticking to my parchment paper. So in the past I have used cotton towels or tea towels before, and it seemed to be less sticky, or perhaps my cake was slightly too warm when I flipped it over. So either way, I think maybe I could have added more powdered sugar perhaps, but it didn't really bother me too much. I mean, it didn't look the prettiest when I unrolled it, but I basically just kind of took my fingers and took off the outer surface of the cake, and honestly nobody can tell. We're gonna dust this thing with powdered sugar like snow later, so. And then for serving, I do like to cut off the ends on each side just because I feel like it's just a little bit prettier that way, but it doesn't really matter. It still tastes delicious, and of course you can taste test your creation before you serve it to guests. And in terms of frosting, I generally don't frost my jelly roll cakes or Swiss cakes just because it's pretty casual, but also looks like you put a little bit of effort. But I do like to give a generous dusting of powdered sugar, and given the fact that this is a matcha green tea cake, it's not very sweet, but it's just sweet enough, and I think the addition of the powdered sugar just kind of it's the perfect cherry on top, And it's so delicious. It's very light and airy, spongy, and of course that really decadent creamy, rich whipped cream. I mean, how can you go wrong with whipped cream? And red bean is just delicious. And paired with green tea, I think it makes the perfect pairing, sweet and a little bit bitter, of course, from that green tea. So delicious. So make sure to give it a try. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Also, I'm open to any recipe suggestions. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, notification bell. And I appreciate your time here. Thank you so much for watching, and Happy New Year. Bye.